After 3 long years going back and forth, the Russia-Ukraine war is done. Only problem is, Russia is yet to realize it. Following a quick invasion in 2022, the Russian offensive stalled, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties and crippling both economies. But now, the world has taken a stand and the war is finished. Russia lost, and in this long video, we will look at exactly why. While many believe this war began in 2022, this is not true. In fact, the real war began on February 20th, 2014. Russia moved in on Crimea, not only defeating Ukraine, but completely annexing the territory. Following a peace agreement signed a year later, Russia would hold on to this annexed territory. Moreover, the Ukrainians stood alone, without any Western assistance. Following the ceasefire, the two countries continued to have diplomatic spats, but nothing that would lead to an actual war. The incidents, mainly naval and cyber-related, would wreak havoc on Ukraine, but the country survived. This was until 2019, when a comedian gained extreme popularity nationwide. On May 20th of the same year, Volodymyr Zelensky officially took the oath of office and became the Ukrainian president. Unfortunately, the Russians saw him as a liberal and Western puppet who moved Ukraine more in line with the rest of Europe. This didn't sit well with the former Soviets. In early 2022, Russia launched a stunning invasion. It nearly surrounded Ukraine on the eastern side, even going as far as pulling Belarus directly into the war. In fact, Russian troops and weaponry were stationed on the Belarus border, with the Kremlin planning an offensive from the north. It all played out as President Putin wanted, with troops slowly sweeping in. But Ukraine was ready, and around the Kiev region, they had already dug in. As the Russian troops moved to the capital, they met fierce resistance, which completely stalled the offensive. By destroying various airports and runways, Ukraine could stunt the Russian aerial offense. And without any air superiority, the Russians found it far more difficult to continue moving forward with the offensive push. Once front lines were established, it turned into a war of attrition. The Russians figured that stalling the war would cripple Ukraine, and eventually the country would merely surrender. But the Western world was keeping a watchful eye on the situation. During the first few months, the West intervened, with the United States and Europe among many other countries vowing to protect Ukraine. President Zelensky would ditch his suit for a pair of military colors, slowly winning the hearts and minds of the citizens. By mid-2022, Zelensky was hailed a hero all over the world, and every president wanted to be associated with the man fighting for Ukrainian peace and sovereignty. The aid began pouring in, billions of dollars in humanitarian aid, and military equipment would be shipped to Poland before making its way into Ukraine by train. Newer and more advanced technology began appearing on the battlefield, further intensifying the conflict and slowly giving the Ukrainians a technology boost over their enemies. Meanwhile, Ukrainians were moved out to surrounding countries, where soldiers were trained by Western forces. Upon returning to the battlefield, these soldiers would make a massive difference, and on numerous fronts, Ukraine began pushing back against the Russian onslaught, further crippling Russian morale and leaving President Putin with a few questions of what to do now. The Kremlin kept on doubling down, eventually transforming the battlefield into a meat grinder, simply sending troops to meet their maker and just replacing them with new troops once they lost their lives. It gave Russia hope as the Kremlin saw small gains. However, it all changed when Ukraine received the coveted Patriot missile and HIMARS systems. By 2024, Ukraine's military was almost fully westernized, and with more aid streaming into Kyiv, Ukraine unleashed a counteroffensive. In early August, the Ukrainian 80th Brigade, accompanied by the Special Forces, proceeded deep into the Kursk Oblast. In what can only be described as a blitzkrieg, the Ukrainians progressed deep into Russian territory, capturing a large stretch of land, including many villages. The attack caught Russia by surprise, However, this moment proved to the world that the Russian army was not doing too well, and perhaps there could be a chance for Ukraine to actually emerge victorious on the battlefield. The operation lasted a few months, and by March 2025, Russia finally regained the territory, but it was too late. Despite progress on the southern front and pushing Ukraine out of Kursk, the writing was already on the wall, and Russia lost the war. But why? When the war started, Ukraine found themselves vastly outnumbered. In fact, the Russians had more than 900,000 troops simply moving on Ukraine. This didn't even begin to cover the more than 2 million troops in the Russian reserve. On the other side of the battlefield, Ukraine had merely 190,000 troops, giving Russia an almost 5-to-1 advantage in just military personnel. On top of this, Ukraine was left with only the old T-64 main battle tanks, which had become obsolete or even useless since they hailed from the early Soviet era. Even by the 1970s, the Russians had already replaced these fossils with the newer T-80 main battle tank. As the war started, the Russians were using more than 3,500 main battle tanks, made up of mostly T-80 and T-90 models. Ukraine did slightly modernize these tanks to create the T-64 Bulet model, which included the Contact 5 explosive reactive armor ERA, a 125mm smoothbore gun capable of firing guided missiles, and upgraded fire control systems. Unfortunately, the old T-64 platform was still heavily relied upon to make this work, and with Russia now the aggressor, it was almost impossible for Ukraine to source more components. Essentially, the Ukrainian tanks were obsolete, and they vigorously relied on drones and other Western equipment, like the Patriot missiles, to stunt the Russian offensive. Moreover, there was a real concern over the Ukrainian skies. With Russia historically fielding a decent air force, everyone expected the Kremlin to quickly establish air superiority. With 1,500 combat aircraft and 500 attack helicopters, Russia was outmatching Ukraine by 13-to-1. And this doesn't even begin to cover the quality difference between the two countries' aircraft. But if the skies didn't make you cringe, the naval disparity surely would. Just looking at the Russian Black Sea Fleet alone, with its cruiser, 6 frigates, destroyers, and numerous support vessels, led by the coveted Moskva, Russia already outnumbered the 15 vessels Ukraine had to contend with. This advantage was pronounced early on as Russia began sweeping the Ukrainian coast, and even going as far as crippling the economy. During the first few months, the Russians blocked the Black Sea, completely preventing Ukraine from exporting its highly coveted grains. Finally, Ukraine did deal with this through various meetings and agreements, but the most important would be the sinking of the Russian flagship, the Moskva, in the Black Sea. This essentially nullified the Russian naval advantage and shifted focus back to the battlefield. Numerous strikes on bridges connecting Russia to Ukraine further complicated Russian advances, but it was mainly the weather and treacherous landscapes covered in snow that stunted the Russian offensive as winter set in. Regardless of these numerical and tech advantages, the Russians found themselves fighting not against other military equipment, but against the will and stubborn resilience Ukrainians had. Their undying will to win the war and to remain a sovereign state would ultimately test everything Russia had. We will dive into a little more of these scenarios a little later as we look at specifics on the battlefield. For now, make sure you are locked in and subscribe to our channel. You don't want to miss what we have planned for the next few weeks. Initially, the Russians estimated that a blitzkrieg offensive would lead to the fall of Kyiv within a few days, but the battle stalled out in the first few days. By day 3, Russia had to ask some serious questions about whether they would still be able to do this. In fact, Ukraine went as far as shelling its own airport. They might have lost this critical piece of infrastructure, but it was better than giving Russian fighters a close runway to launch from. Moreover, the Biden administration used the CIA to send intelligence reports to Ukraine, further breaking down the Russian offensive. But when aid finally poured into Ukraine, things were about to change. By August 2022, U.S. intelligence reported that Russia had lost at least 80,000 troops, who were either struck down, critically wounded, or captured. This proved a grave error in calculation from the Kremlin. This number continued to rise, and a year into the war in February 2023, Russia had lost more than 100,000 troops. This was a stark contrast to the Afghan-Soviet War, where Russia lost only 15,000 troops by the end of the first year. Tension began rising in Russia, and the public grew more and more frustrated seeing soldiers lose their lives. This meant that the Kremlin had to double down on blocking information and further calling up more and more troops. At least one public bout of conscription was ordered during the first 2 years, with many believing that even more troops of working age had been conscripted into the military without their consent. Meanwhile, Ukraine received the coveted U.S. main battle tank, the M1 Abrams, which is widely considered the best main battle tank in the world. Russia continued pushing, but met fierce resistance as the M1 Abrams continued to outclass it on the battlefield. As the F-16 Fighting Falcons found their way to Ukraine, things changed even more. Instead of Soviet-era MiGs, Ukraine was now using a fourth-generation fighter. This gave them a little reprieve in the skies, and with the HIMARS system devastating the Russian advances, it was game over. But Russia was yet to realize this. North Korea eventually joined the war, sending tens of thousands of troops to Russia. Many seeing an opportunity for freedom took it, and others were untrained and lost their lives pretty senselessly. The Russian collaboration with Kim Jong-un completely failed. Now, Russia did make a stunning move in March 2025 by retaking Kursk, but the numbers don't lie. Compared to Ukraine, Russia was losing more troops, equipment, and even manufacturing plants. But the biggest problem became the Russian economy. Following the initial invasion in 2014, the Russian Federation was already undergoing numerous sanctions. This was ramped up following the 2022 invasion, and with many top oligarchs losing their Western assets, a lot of dissent arose in Russia. Moreover, the biggest global companies like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Nike withdrew their business in Russia. This cost many people their jobs, sending inflation through the roof. But Russia could always rely on its oil and military sales. China and India mostly drove the Russian oil sales, while Europe was slowly seeking a way to break their dependency on Russian energy. Countries like Iran continued buying Russian military equipment, with all these things bolstering the Russian economy even further. In fact, midway through the war, the Russian economy was flourishing, having managed to claw back most of these losses and revitalize their economy. Unfortunately, President Donald Trump would put the final nail in the coffin. Once the Trump administration took over in early 2025, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief vowed to bring an end to the war. He emasculated President Zelensky in mid-February, again making the world believe that Ukraine could potentially lose this war. But his attacks on the rest of the world would give Ukraine the advantage. Despite no aid going to Ukraine, President Donald Trump's tariffs, especially the 245% put on China, would completely change the scope of the war. As the global economy began reeling, oil prices dropped significantly, at one point reaching under $60 a barrel. This meant that Russia would not profit in the same way they had done from these sales. Inflation took effect, rising above 20%, and leading to interest rates reaching a riveting 11%. It became unbearable for the average Russian citizen. On top of this, the Russians took further losses on the battlefield. The Kremlin resorted to digging up old, buried equipment for refurbishment to bolster their attack. President Putin also announced another round of conscription, but no one was willing to be sent to the meat grinder Russia called a war. So, why did Russia lose the war? The culmination of all these factors sowed dissension in the minds of the average Russian. If the war is to stop now and Russia doesn't have to give back its stolen territory, the Kremlin could claim victory. Since many resources are located in the eastern part of Ukraine, It could make Russia a richer country. But as troops are losing their lives and Russia is struggling to replenish equipment, Ukraine might not opt for an immediate ceasefire. In fact, the current state of the war gives Ukraine the advantage, and now Russia is scrambling. If the war continues, it is very likely that Ukraine will take back even more territory, diminishing the wins of the Russians. This could put Russia in a very precarious situation. They will be losing territory without any real way of retaking it. Essentially, it is a slow and painful death for the Russians. Perhaps accepting a peace deal now, before it is too late, and giving up some of its taken territory would help President Putin save some face. But for now, the likelihood of Russia winning is not great, and thanks to an undying will to live, Ukraine has basically won this war. Now, we will look at some of the key events that took place during this war, giving you a rundown of exactly what happened in 2025 to help Ukraine overcome its Russian adversaries.